Look, we've all been there. We've all had that moment where, we open up the PlayStation Store and just peruse through the endless list of shit that is on sale. But in the hope that you might find something that appeals to you on a good sale. And look, there's plenty to be had on the PlayStation Store, we all know full and well. I found myself in one of these moods scrolling through, and I came across an item that immediately jumped out to me for a multitude of reasons. It's a little game, well, not little, it's a game called the DioField Chronicle. And it's pulled me in immediately for a few reasons. One, the art style was very, very familiar to me. I didn't know until I opened it, of course, but you could immediately recognize it if you're familiar with the likes of Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy. There is, of course, a Square Enix project, and obviously the art style they've carried over here. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I didn't think Square Enix made something exclusively, or rather, something for PlayStation that was in the RPG genre, because, why wouldn't it come on Switch in that case? But in any case, I was immediately pulled by that because I actually really like the aesthetic of the art style of the portraits that were in the likes of Octopath Traveler and Triangle Strategy, and immediately was drawn into this as well. And I opened it and I looked for a few trailers and such online, and again the premise kind of drew me in a bit. It very simply put, immediately off the bat, it reminded me of, I guess, PlayStation's attempt for Fire Emblem Three Houses was what I could, in my mind, put together at the time. There is some sort of war aspect going on. There's a kingdom, there's an alliance, and there's an empire, and there's a bunch of characters. And in very loose terms, that is Fire Emblem Three Houses. That is a gross simplification of Fire Emblem Three Houses, but in my mind, it was essentially PlayStation's attempt for Three Houses. In my mind, before I kicked off, so I thought, all right, and I think the special edition, which came with the digital art book and the soundtrack, and the game itself was all out. I think it was for €37, which probably isn't a great sign, all things considered. That it was on sale, that deep of a sale that quickly. I think it was like down from a 70 something. Not a great sign when the game literally just came out, I think, September in 2022. So maybe not the greatest idea for sales, or the greatest indication that they were very good sales. But there's enough there to pull me in based on some previous experiences, because obviously Fire Emblem Three Houses is flipping awesome, and I liked what I've seen and done in Octopath Traveler so far. I haven't finished the game, but I really liked that style. And I thought, okay, sure, I'm in it. Let's do it. And so I purchased it, and now I've played it through twice, and I have lots of things to share or talk about of a game that I think has really strong potential and does some things really well, and in retrospect does some things really well, but also missed out. I look at this and I can't help but feel a little bit of regret, in the sense that I had such a big opportunity with what it had, and it didn't quite deliver the experience I think it could have been. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the stuff that the game missed out on. We're going to talk about some of the story stuff that I thought was really, really good, or some story stuff that I thought maybe was a bit lacking. We're just going to go break it all down and have a fun time doing it, because it's one of the one of the taglines of it is a deep immersive story with strategic real-time combat. And I want to pull the deep and immersive story aspect of that part, because I think it's immersive, but not as deep as it could have been. And so that's where we want to focus on today, is just kind of dig into it from a point of view of storytelling and fantasy, and some of these genres I'm really, really interested in. And obviously if you've seen some of my stuff at Axiom Verge, to theorize in the same vein. And there's a lot to theorize with this game, because there's a lot of show versus tell aspects here. There are some things that are explicitly told, and it's like, I don't know, man, maybe you could have developed this a little bit more rather than outright saying it. But in retrospect, there's a lot of show here, and the things that make sense, you really have to study for, because it's very easy to miss them the first time. And when the ending arrives, you're like, what on earth? But the hints were there all along. So that's what we're going to look into today's the DioField Chronicle. I really enjoyed it, more so for the story aspect rather than the gameplay aspect. Gameplay aspect got pretty repetitive and boring after a while, and that was a shame of it. I'm going to get into why it felt so boring and repetitive compared to, say, Fire Emblem Three Houses. And look, I think I'm just going to go ahead and say now, there is probably going to be spoilers for, obviously there's going to be spoilers for this, obviously, the DioField Chronicle. Also spoilers for Fire Emblem Three Houses, just because I'm going to be comparing the two a lot in terms of things that Three Houses does versus what the DioField Chronicle does, because I think they are comparable in many different ways. And there is one key aspect that separates them from each other, which I would say elevates Three Houses into the amazing experience that it is, versus the DioField Chronicle, which I think was enjoyable, and I enjoyed it because I'm a hardcore kind of fantasy kind of fan, but for maybe the casual player, maybe they found it more difficult to get immersed in it, like say you might in Fire Emblem Three Houses. So that's what we're going to look into today. So after all of that spiel, let's get into it. I will say, for the record, just before we get started here, obviously this is quite a long video. My thoughts on this are I don't have a script. I just have some loose bullet points in my head, and I run basically off of those. So there are maybe times where I do repeat myself slightly, or maybe make the same point twice. Again, just bear with me. I'll edit as much as I can of that out where I stumble or anything of the sort, but I don't work with a script. This is all just off my head, my own observations, and my own kind of bullet points, etc. So I do apologize if it gets repetitive at some stage, but bear with me. It does end up going somewhere, I'm sure. But yeah, let's get into it. Something that I think the DioField Chronicle really struggles with is its pacing, and how it doesn't allow events or developments or dynamics to settle or to develop those dynamics before swiftly moving on to the next thing. And then the thing that could have been interesting in retrospect is pushed to the side and sometimes not really done about it. And there's a few story aspects where this kind of comes into the case as well, where it's just not enough time was given to develop certain aspects. Immediately off the bat in Chapter 1, I could think of how even Andrias, Fredret, and Izzy came under the mercenary group of Dukende, and they came under the command of Yulzim Jordan, who I think was an interesting character. I thought he had some interesting thoughts, and his design was cool, and I just think he was an interesting character that could have been A, developed a little bit more before he was killed off at the end of Chapter 1, but B, it takes no time, essentially. Like, you're basically using your tutorial chapter, essentially, before Andrias, Fred, Iscarion, and Waltaquin are all elevated to leaders of the new group, the Blue Foxes. So, like, you don't have this time to develop life as underlings, so to speak. Yes, they rise to the top. They rise as stars in the Duke's unit under Jordan before Jordan's death, but there's like no time really for them to be, to adjusting to life as underlings before they end up becoming top dogs themselves. And just immediately off the bat, that's just Chapter 1. Immediately off the bat, that is something that would set the tone for the game, is that just things move quite quickly, and some things are developed slightly, others again same kind of thing. You're rushing through, brushing them off, and then pushing them to the side. And this is a great example of one of those. It's just like, yeah, already Chapter 2, oh okay, we're already top of the rank here in terms of like we're leaders of the unit now. We only respond to Dukende now. Even the likes of Iscarion and Waltaquin join in back-to-back missions, and all of a sudden we've got two frontal characters. Again, I don't think there's a lot of characters developed in the DioField Chronicle, but we've got 2 of the 4 immediately joining. So again, Iska comes first, and there's no real, again, there's no adjustment period to him being there, so to speak, before we get another major character in Waltaquin. And again, it's just a little off-putting that we don't really see that development put in before we add something else. And that's a problem this game has, is that constantly adding characters. And while Iska and Waltaquin obviously had a lot to the story, this becomes less and less the case as the story goes on. You get more and more characters that fill a role for one part, essentially, and then for the rest of the game they're basically pushed to the side. And again, it just feels rushed. Waltaquin and Iscarion joining so quickly together as two frontal characters, and then obviously they immediately go to the top of the chain here when Yulzim dies. And it's like, from a story perspective, why isn't Izzy part of that? Like, why you'd have to assume, being with Andrias and Fred, that Izzy would have been part of the leadership of the Blue Foxes, but she's completely pushed aside. It's all about Isca, Waltaquin, Rias, and Fred. And I guess again that's fine. Those are the characters you developed, and I don't find Izzy particularly interesting. But from a story perspective, in world, it doesn't make any sense why Izzy is kind of pushed to the side in that regard. And constantly at the story, it's very much reflected in the fact that she's on the outside looking in, and there's a bunch of instances where, as you go around the halls of Elm Camp between missions, she's on an outside of a door, and the likes of Fred or Iscarion are inside said room. It's usually the one upstairs, and so again, like I don't, it makes like, these two characters are so quickly, and then others are pushed aside. So like Izzy, again, important character for the first 30 minutes, becomes less important for the rest of the game because we've added so quickly two characters. We haven't let Iscarion settle it all, and then before we even get into Waltaquin's whole thing. So I don't know, just even from that perspective, it just felt a little rushed in that regard. Other story aspects I thought went way too quickly was obviously Chapter 5 was obviously a huge issue with this. Not only with the Waltaquin arc, but then obviously by this stage, of course, Prince Ivangar has already been killed, and there's obviously a civil war essentially between the two factions that support Staris Shatham and Victor Shatham. And in the midst of all of this, both of them are just killed instantly, basically by Waltaquin as soon as she defects, and all of a sudden you're going to fight Waltaquin, and it's all over very quickly. And I thought the whole game was summed up brilliantly in a sense, with how too quickly it moved. With basically, as you take down Waltaquin outside and take care of her dragon, and Andrias says, "I'm going inside too," I think he says it to Iscarion. And then the next scene is literally, it's a calm scene outside where the fighting's over outside, and then immediately shifts to basically the pivotal fighting moment of Waltaquin versus Andrias, with no dialogue beforehand, nothing. You're just thrust into a fight that's over in like 15 seconds later. So I don't know. I just, from that aspect of things, that whole chapter, I think they really missed a chance to not only just sell the Civil War a bit more, but all of a sudden Waltaquin's aims are never explained so much. It's what, to end the world, her dull world. I don't understand fully what she wants to do with that. Staris is dead, Victor is dead, the whole Civil War aspect is shoved away, and Waltaquin is defected. It all happened so quickly. That wasn't at the start of chapter, that's during chapter 5. It just moves so quickly, and some of these things aren't developed enough. It's the whole dynamic between Victor, Staris, and obviously Fred, revealing that he is Levantia Shatham. That dynamic is not allowed to settle so much. How do Victor or Staris, who have no faces, by the way, they're just shadows essentially, how do they feel about their potential brother being alive? And obviously he bears the mark. They don't. I don't know. I think there's so much more you could have done with that. But they're both offed by Waltaquin. Waltaquin is then offed with no real explanation of her details. It's all just shoved so quickly, and it's over so quickly, that you think it's, again, just pacing is just a big issue with this game, and it really throws you out of the immersion sometimes. We're outside and now we're fighting Waltaquin. Now Waltaquin is dead. Oh, and Staris Shatham's now dead too. Cool. So I don't know. It's a little frustrating at times, but that chapter in particular was a big issue in this regard. Obviously, after that is more so the decline, or I guess you could call it the decline of Fred as he descends in terms of his grab for power and what power is doing to his head. That does happen a little quickly. There's a few riffs that I think maybe aren't developed enough with regards, more so Andrias. Andrias shows his discontent a little bit through chapter 6 and obviously through chapter 7 as well. But I think the aspect would have made the final bit a bit more, I think it would have made a bit more sense first time seeing it. I think would have been to heighten the conflict between Andrias and Fred after the mission where Fred wants to drive out the Empire by basically focusing his entire army essentially in one place. and leaving the kingdom vulnerable elsewhere. And Andrias comments on this, but after the fact it's done, and basically now they're at the point where, again, very quickly we're at, we've just won a battle now. Basically, the kingdom's on the point of surrender. Instead of Andrias focusing on I told you this was going to happen, I told you this was a mistake, he's more like, well, it's done. There's no point. When Fred asks how does this happen, Andrew's like, there's no point. Basically conjecture on it now. Basically, what do we do now? Essentially, even though I think in his mind he's already made up his mind what he's going to do, which I think is part of the reason why he plays it off, because it's like, I think at that point his mind is made up, and what's the point in getting angry anymore? But I think they could have used that to heighten the tension a little bit more than I think they did. But so I feel less so inclined to say Fred's decline was rushed, more so than obviously than the stuff in chapter 5, but it still feels a little quick for it to happen. And yeah, again that immediately comes from chapter 6. We've just pushed all that other stuff to the side, and it's just, I don't know, it feels like it moves a little quickly, and it doesn't quite give him time to settle enough before we move on to the next thing. So again, I feel like not enough time is allowed to pass between certain events, and quarrels not allowed to develop enough, tension, conflict not allowed to develop enough before we're immediately moving on to the next thing. Another aspect that I really struggled to justify with some of the storytelling means that kind of accelerated some of the plot is more so how the story was told in between or after mission cutscenes. And I felt like this was most reflective in the Iscarion versus Andrias cutscene after Fred was crowned. There have been plenty of tensions between Iscarion and Fred in the build-up to Fred being king, obviously through their split views of democracy, but very little in terms of Andrias and Iscarion. There were references here and there through chatter between Iscarion and Andrias about the future, but nothing I would say that was massively confrontational. And even Andrias overhearing Iscarion's conversation with Tremina, I still don't think that was anything confrontational, so to speak. But when Fred is king, or is crowned king, we just get this cutscene that all of a sudden Andrias is now facing off with Iscarion, and this is hardly developed. The rift between those two is hardly developed. The conflict non-existent almost before just being told that Andrias now faces off against Iscarion, who wants to leave. Again, a cutscene with this conversation, or an in-game conversation between the two, voice acted or not, I think would have really heightened the actual sense of Iscarion leaving, because you did sense it was coming, but it just happened. When it did happen, even that, they managed to even make it that even feel sudden, between just the way it was brought up, rather than having it done in-game as opposed to just an after battle cutscene, which I think far too much was exposed, I guess, or told in those, rather than, again, through dialogue between two or multiple characters. I think it would have added so much more to the experience, rather than just dumping it essentially in end of mission or beginning of mission cutscenes or narrations, which is something that Fire Emblem Three Houses very much tries to avoid, more so in part 1 than obviously part 2, where obviously it's giving an up-to-date I guess briefing of the war as it's going on, whereas in part 1 it's just more sort of a cultural thing. But I feel like obviously in Three Houses a lot of it is in dialogue, and in DioField a lot of some of the more interesting face-offs or conversations that are surrounding conflict, I think, could have been had rather than just dumped in an after battle narration like Andrias versus Iscarion was. Again, we don't get to hear Iscarion's gratefulness, that is the thanks that he expressed to Andrias, or the word of warning that may have been to him as he left about the path they were going on. It's all like I get there's certain things you're left to infer, and I think that's fine, but again, I think you could have invested more into the conflict, the actual confrontational aspect of the conflict between Andrias and Iscarion, rather than just the, I guess, more so dancing around, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's leaving, and as Andrias has got his blade pulled out, he's going to let him leave. Again, you could have done that and shown us in a cutscene. That would have been more impactful than just seeing it just as it was narrated. again, that tension really kind of disappears. So again, I feel like just kind of brushing through that and rushing through that took away from something that could have been. It's one of the more impactful moments of this. Like, you're losing one of your main. Again, if you don't have many main invested characters in this game, we've killed one of them in Waltaquin. Okay, cool. That happened a bit quickly, but whatever. And Iscarion's a pretty major part of this game and one of the major characters, and his conflicts have been pretty clear through most of it, especially when the whole democracy element comes into it. And all of a sudden, like, he just leaves in a cutscene, and it's like an after narration. It's like, I don't know. It just felt a little. Oh, all right. Well, I guess there's a bow that's now spare. I don't know. Again, I feel like time not invested enough into developing these aspects, and then when the payoff or the event happens, it's Iscarion wants to leave, and now Andrias is debating whether to kill him or let him go. We see nothing of that. It's just like we're told that, and it's just left wanting for a major moment in the game. And again, there's a bunch of these that fall in that we've talked about so far fall into a similar category. And again, it's just not enough time was invested putting into these events that when they do happen, the payoff isn't as strong because we haven't put as much time into developing some of these conflicts, these tensions, some of these story arcs. It's just a little too soon. And or in Iscarion's case, again, it was referenced that he was surprised, Andrias was surprised he didn't leave sooner. And I think that's fine. And he basically had 3 full chapters at this stage of kind of things beginning to shift for him within the unit. So that was, there's very much time given to Iscarion's, I guess, hesitance and reluctance in some regards, and his loyalty was clearly beginning to wane. Their time was put into that, but not the actual conflict between himself and Andrias that would basically have Andrias deciding whether to kill him or to let him go. And again, we saw plenty of anger between Iscarion and Fred, but not a lot in the way of Iscarion and Andrias. I think that part was lacking to make that moment be a little bit more confusing as to why he would be so hesitant to let him go or to kill him or let him go. Again, I wish more time was put into that between 2 major characters of the story. Even going back to the Civil War in Alatain, I think something that could have heightened some of the dramatic feel or the emotion of the whole thing is that Prince Ivangar is someone that is clearly looked up to. He is a role model. He is a fantastic general, warrior. He's got the aptitude for politics. Basically, he's seen as obviously he's seen as that he's the next king. He's got the mark. He's basically a perfect role model, so to speak, for the people of Alatain. He was beloved. And I wish we'd had a bit more, any conversation or interaction with him that would have made his death, A, more shocking, but B, obviously throws into the whole wider aspect of the Civil War, because obviously Ivangar falls, and now obviously there's obviously Victor and Staris, staking their claims to the throne, whereas when Ivangar is alive, there's none of that. And it doesn't, there should have been a greater sense of loss in the story when Ivangar was killed. And again, I just feel like that was a missed opportunity to develop some of that, to heighten some of that belief that you're only really told about more so than anything else. But even just to see him in person, to get a sense of his charisma, everything that he was said to be, to meet him, to grow, to have that attachment to him, even just slightly, just a bit more personable, even just by seeing him interact with the Blue Foxes, would have done more to heighten then the shock of his defeat and death. And obviously then the fallout from that obviously feels a little bit more significant, even just from that personal touch of having seen him in person at least. I feel like they missed opportunity with Ivangar to heighten some of the tensions and the shock and the grief in many ways that it was the people felt after Ivangar's death. They were completely demoralized after that, and that's how the Empire gained a bit of a ground in Alatain. Was just they were just completely demoralized after that, and it would have been we could have empathized with that demoralization a little bit more if we just gotten to know him a little more, interacted with him a little bit. I just feel like that was a missed opportunity because he's got a good designed character. He's obviously he's got a lot of likable traits. Again, it would have added to the experience the shock and sadness, even somewhat, of losing Ivangar. And just, I don't know, if you could just develop that, because he was the hope. Obviously, King Rhaegal was ill. Ivangar really was the hope of the kingdom. And I don't disagree with him. From a story's perspective, I don't. It's, if you want to kill him off, that's fine. It creates the dynamic that we have for chapters 4 and 5, and obviously, 2 basically planting the seeds that 2 incompetent heirs vying for the throne obviously helps inspire Fredret's, his wish to see Levantia himself, in a sense, on the throne, and he could do a better job of it than the other 2, and he is more of a worthy candidate than Stavros and Victor. That's fine. All that could have been heightened just a little bit by just the interaction with Ivangar. So I feel like they really missed out developing Ivangar a bit here, and again, no interaction just makes me feel like it was a little rushed in some regards. He's just sort of a namesake. His death has an impact on the story, but I think it could have had a more of an emotional impact, and elements like that had, they're just that been a little bit of more of a connection and interaction with the mighty Prince Ivangar. I actually feel really bad for Prince Ivangar, just to mention him one more time. He kind of carries a similar resemblance to Dimitri in Fire Emblem Three Houses, and there's a likeness between. I just feel a great shame in terms of Ivangar's death, in a sense that, again, we didn't know anything about him, so again, his death, I don't think is as emotional as it could have been. But, obviously he was this great hope for the future, a courageous person, a charismatic prince, and just how it ended, just to be just shot, essentially, just highlight how completely outclassed the Alateans were versus the Empire. He's coming to a sword fight. Basically, Zavati and Shuko is bringing a gun to a sword fight, essentially, just completely outclassed. I have to imagine, he says he got shot in the chest, but I have to imagine he was just, one was just shoved in his head as well. The thought of it is actually pretty upsetting when you think about it. You think of the Grey Hope just snuffed out so easily. Like it didn't, like, it amounted to nothing in the end. Ivangar's training and the Mark of the Blessed, and it just meant nothing when the Empire shows up and can just fire one shot and just pierces his armor, and that's it. It's done. It's over. The hope of a nation that I don't think it really ever fully recovered from. Obviously, with the split in, not only just from a morale point of view, the split then between, the Alatean's forces, and basically they're shedding their own blood when they need to be focused on repelling the Empire. They're, between Victor and Stavros' forces, essentially. It's, you're wasting resources, and you've got a more common enemy together. And yeah, I just find it sad in many ways. And I guess it's like Dimitri in a sense, in some parts in Three Houses, it's very much, like the once Grey Hope is just extinguished. So there's such a hollow feeling after it. It is a very hollow feeling, and I just see the resemblance between the two. And again, we don't know anything about Ivangar in terms of not as much as obviously we would Dimitri in Three Houses, but yeah, it just feels so hollow and empty. It's actually quite sad. Yeah, I just thought it was interesting, and it's really interesting dynamic. I think it's lost in the whole thing. It's actually, I think the whole story itself, we'll talk about it, but I think the whole story itself is actually quite, looking back, it's actually, I think, more sad than anything else. It's sad how people ended up coming to decisions they had to do, and I actually look back at it, and actually it's quite, I think it's ultimately a sad story. Like, I think it's really a sad story. In a similar vein to Prince Ivangar, something else I think I could have benefited the story having a bit more advantage, having been mentioned, was Princess Hezalea. This is a character we knew nothing about, absolutely didn't know existed until it becomes relevant or necessary for the plot to introduce her. She's one of the few, she's obviously a princess of the Shatham dynasty. Everyone else is mentioned, obviously Levanti and Shatham is mentioned obviously very early on and throughout. Victor, Stavros, they're brought up as well after the death of Ivangar. You know, these are all mentioned as, you know, Shathams in the part of the royal line, but only when it's relevant do we bring up the fact that, oh, suddenly there's a sister here that can, that can confirm Fred's lineage essentially. Conveniently, she just exists now all of a sudden. I think it would take nothing just to mention her name once or twice in the previous 4 or 5 chapters, that when it's mentioned when it's mentioned to go rescue her, there's like, oh yeah, we know her, in your mind, hold on, maybe she could have, confirm Fred's lineage. It's just something that, again, nothing would have been required to mention her existence. Again, forget anything to do with her character. Her existence at least could have been mentioned, and not just felt like, oh, I felt like it was made up. Oh, here we go. Hey, there's a sister that can confirm Fred lineage. Oh, how convenient. You know, just state the existence of a said sister well beforehand, and you can get that out of the way early, and boom. You know, it's not so much of a problem when you bring it up. It's like, oh yeah, she exists. That's handy enough. Whereas it's like she's been created just for that purpose. Like, oh, here's the sister we didn't know existed that, hey, can just happen to back up Fred's lineage, and that's cool. I don't know. It just feels like just inserted, it felt like the creators inserted her as necessary, so to speak. Like, oh, we need someone who can confirm Fred's lineage. Hey, there's a sister that wouldn't recognize him these days, having been so young. Let's do that. That's how it felt like. Again, just pushed in there, and just, yeah, there you go. There's something. There's a MacGuffin that we can use, in a sense, a human MacGuffin, essentially. There we go. There's our mission for the month. A sister we didn't, not just anyone. This is a princess of the Shatham dynasty. It just happens to exist now. It didn't exist up until this point. It's like, oh, okay, cool. That's neat, I guess. Again, just pulls you away a little bit out of the whole thing. It just makes you feel like they're making something just so convenient for that purpose. Again, would have taken nothing to mention it just anything prior beforehand. You know, it's not as if there wasn't enough opportunity to do so with some sort of Shatham talk. All you had to do was mention it once, essentially. It would have been fine for a callback later. But no, nothing of the sort. And that's frustrating, to say the least. I think that was a frustrating aspect of that whole part of it was, yeah, oh, she just exists. Neat. Let's go save her to advance our ends, because, you know, it didn't exist until now. Yeah, it was just a rough one, I think, from that point of view. The pacing of the story is something I do have a problem with, but I think what could arguably, considered as a greater sin, or as equal as that, is the characters. And there's a lot of characters playable in this game, but sadly, really out of the likes of Andrias, Fred, Iscarion, and Waltaquin, there's not a lot of really interesting characters after that. I would say this game is largely devoid of character outside of the main 4. That's a problem when you're having so many characters and have some of them be involved in the story for particular parts. There's a lot of characters that you look here, like, in the grand scheme of things, we could really do without. Certainly, just some characters add absolutely very, like, what does Chapelman add here to this story? Absolutely nothing. He's got a decent backstory, and his design is neat, but he adds nothing to the main story, so to speak, which is, again, there's a bunch of characters that are similar to that as well. Catherine adds very little in the end. She fulfills one very loose end for the church's stuff, which again is, in a sense, that is something that isn't very developed much, really. Again, referenced to a few times, and obviously comes up a little bit through the Civil War, when Archbishop Joshua, who we know very little about as well, backs Starus Shatham. Again, nothing really doing. Umarida has a different function. We'll get to her in a bit. Castovir does very, very little after his one story influences. He warns that the Alliance is about to attack after the Duquesne negotiations. Cool. He's a character we have to keep for the rest of the way. Does very, very little. Shivat is very, very similar. Defects from the Ardwolves. His whole thing is, again, he could have been developed more, because he's someone who has intimate knowledge and history of House Redditch and Waltaquin. Again, Waltaquin's one of the more interesting characters. We could have incorporated Shivat a bit more into that, But no, it's very little. There's a few conversations here and there, but for the story purposes, again, very little. Rickenback, very similar situation. I actually used Rickenback to replace Iscarion after Iscarion left, so I used her from a gameplay point of view. But other than that, again, her place again, could have been interesting. You know, she was a person that I think the Blue Fox's leaders like Iscarion, even to an extent Andrias as well, looked to as someone that really grew and developed. But again, that mentor side of things was dropped, and there wasn't much done with her. Like, we didn't get to focus on her after Iscarion left. And again, Tremina is a very similar thing. She fulfills a part of the Iscarion arc for the democracy angle. And again, she has one interesting conversation when Iscarion leaves. But again, for the story purposes, again, she doesn't offer a large part for her to stay around. Estald offers a little bit more, I think, but again, similar situation. Again, just doesn't really add much other than one mission. Dolavar really adds nothing. Izzy, as we mentioned, kind of gets pushed very much to the side. Zoroark, again, for someone who has known, you know, Fred and Andrea since they were young, not enough of this, not enough of his angle or his opinion or perception or perspective rather is leaned into enough as someone who has intimate knowledge, obviously basically being a father figure for Fred and in some ways Andrias, maybe less so Andrias in retrospect, but obviously someone who took those boys in after they escaped when the assassination of Levantia Shatham occurred, basically took them in and basically helped them to, you know, partly to get where they are to this day. Again, that is not really leaned into enough. Hezelia Shatham, again, I wish more was done with, but she came to the fray very late. Some of her stuff is quite interesting, but Hezelia Shatham I can forgive because she is more so useful for, I guess, the story going forward rather than the story that's gone by or the story that took place in the DioField Chronicle. We can get to Hezelia Shatham in a little bit, but just so many characters added very, very little. The only 4 characters that are properly developed in that are playable are Andrias, Fredret, Iscarion, and Waltaquin. Waltaquin obviously is killed off at the end of chapter 5. Iscarion leaves not long after somewhere in chapter 6. So even those two drop out at the end. We're left with Andrias and Fred. And other than that, we've got a bunch of either meaningless or extremely underused or undeveloped characters. And that's a shame for a game that is, you know, prodding itself on multiple characters. And a shame in the sense for it's a far departure from the likes of Octopath Traveler, where like immediately off the bat, one of the things I loved about Octopath Traveler is that immediately you've got characters with fascinating insights or stories or backstories that are immediately very, very interesting, likes of Primrose and what's his name? The thief. I can't. The name escapes me. I don't work with a script here, by the way, so all this is kind of off the top of my head. But just immediately, there are a bunch of characters that are immediately interesting off the bat. You can get behind their journey before it even starts, before you started, essentially. Or when chapter 1 is over, you can get behind knowing a little bit of their story and what their path to come is. And that's completely absent, I feel like, here in the DioField Chronicle, and something that Fire Emblem 3 has done extremely well. They make sure that no character is wasted, despite how many multitude of characters there are. There's so many characters in Fire Emblem 3 houses. They ensure that not a single one of those characters is wasted. Now, I would. There are a few exceptions. I would say maybe Leone is whatever as a character, but every character that you wouldn't think anything else of, like if you exclude the likes of Dimitri, Claude, Edelgard, and even take away their vassals, take away Dedue, Hubert, Hilda, there are so many fascinating characters that don't take a main role. You think of Felix, you think of Sylvain, characters that do serve smaller aspects of the story in earlier parts and more so are along for the ride later. They still are incredibly fleshed out characters. They're meaningful characters despite their story contributions, so to speak. Now obviously Felix gets a much bigger contribution in his story in Fire Emblem 3 Hopes with Dimitri in that game, but you think of other houses, you think of like say Lysithia's dynamic with the Golden Deer, you think of Dorothea from the Black Eagles or Ferdinand. These aren't characters that drive the story forward, but they're such deep, intricate characters. They become part of the story. They're part of the journey. And that's why I feel like the Blue Foxes fall short, is that these characters don't really feel part of it because they're not developed enough, they're not part of it enough, and if they are part of it, they're part of it for a very short period of time before they're dumped off to the side before another character comes into the fray and rinse and repeat. We get characters brought in, pushed to the side, more characters brought in, pushed to the side, rinse and repeat essentially till we get to the end of the game. And that's unfortunate. Like that's the big thing separating Three Houses from the DioField Chronicle, because they're both worlds I think you can definitely immerse yourself in. There's a lot to be immersed in the DioField Chronicle. You think of the likes of the Imperial invasion, the Jade that they're after, the uses of Jade, the growing technological advances of the Empire that threaten to overwhelm the Alliance and the Kingdom, and how the Empire blazing the path forward with their technology, whereas the Kingdom is kind of living in the past with their ancient sorcery. There's a lot to be immersed in, but the big difference is characters. You can get immersed in the world of the DioField Chronicle, but without the characters, that some of that immersion is ruined, or it's not ruined. Some of that immersion isn't as full on as it is when you hear a character's plight in Three Houses. That immerses you into the world, the part of the world they're from, and how that world works. And it's from that you've got Edelgard's stories of like how she needs to change that part of the world, and Claude in a similar vein from his aspect as well. Your characters are driving your plot forward, and that's what I think is missing in many regards in this game from your other non-main characters, is that these characters are so lacking and devoid that the whole experience is lessened as a result. And that's what Three Houses does brilliantly, is no character is wasted. Their story means something to someone, and it has some relevance to the actual overarching story, no matter whose plot it is. And that's what I think is really missing from the DioField Chronicles, is this devoid of characters, and the characters that we have aren't done enough with. And that's a massive shame, because there are some really interesting characters with some interesting enough backstories, but very little is done with them, and the very few are developed. And part of what makes Three Houses great is that these characters interact with each other, whereas here they're only interacting with Andrias more so. Again, a few exceptions, again like Tremina and Iscarion, and very even less than that Rickenback and Iscarion. But again, not a lot is done with this. Not a lot is developed with this, and it makes it hard to get. Like, I don't like Catherine's design, for example, is really cool. I just don't give two shits about her as a character. She's uninteresting. Nothing is really done with her with other characters. It's the only exception I would say is she brings out a part of Andrias when she talks about kind of the slave labor or children being abducted. Again, that speaks more to Andrias more than her. And it's just part of what makes the gameplay so repetitive is that you're not spending a lot of time developing your characters in between, like you are with Three Houses, with your support conversations with either the main character Byleth or characters with each other. It's very much where you're hopped more so for one battle, a brief stint in Elm Camp, and then you're thrust back into the repetitive gameplay again. And because that part is so much greater, so much more, you're spending much time in the gameplay than the parts outside of the gameplay, the part that can be used to advance characters, it's just so lacking in the DioField Chronicle compared to Three Houses, and that's what separates the two. So this, again, we've got four great characters, I think, or four good characters. I'll be happy to go through and run through their dynamics and praise what was developed with them. It's just such a shame we've got such a cast of characters outside of that nothing is done with, and that's a great shame. I reckon that's enough shitting on the DioField Chronicle for now. We might do some more later, but because it might seem like I don't like this game. I do like this game. I do like the story. I do like some of the things that are going on. The things I've outlined, I just wish were done to a better degree to make this a masterpiece, so to speak. Sadly, it's lacking in that department, but that's not to say there's a lot of things that they've done well in this game. I've kind of talked about some of it with the world building aspects, like the Jade and the Empire and Alatane and aspects within that. But let's go over again, we talked about devoid of characters. There's four characters here that I think are very well done. Let's go over those four characters and things I really liked about them. And I guess we'll start more so from the lesser of the Lester, maybe, of those characters, and then work up to Andrias. Obviously, there's a lot to say about Andrias, but let's talk about Waltaquin first of all.
Waltaquin.
What a treat. I simply cannot resist.
When you first meet her, Waltaquin comes across as a very soft, well-spoken noble whose house has fallen into ruin, essentially. But it's pretty quickly that her introduction is very much a charade, and her true self is much more sadistic. She has a very twisted moral compass. How this comes about and how this is brought forward, I think, was developed very well. Over time, the medial tasks very much bored her. She had a very fun dynamic with Andrias. The kind of two, very much, I would say, flirting. As much as Andrias might want to protest that, I do think he felt a certain way about her as well, and she felt a certain way about him. That he seemed like Andrias was very much the piece that Waltaquin wanted in her life to complete herself, so to speak, because I think what really she hated was more so the idea of a dull life, and with Andrias it was never quite dull. And it seemed quite clear, more so maybe on, actually it's not quite clear, but more so when you play back through the game on the second time, you really see how much Waltaquin really saw through Andrias and how she suspected something wasn't quite lining up. I think the biggest indicator of this was she was very suspicious about the convenient planting or the convenient letter that was found regarding Duke Hende's involvement with the Empire. She found that quite suspicious. There are a number of things that she found quite suspicious very early on as well with Andrias. And in turn, Andrias, I think, was immediately alerted himself when it regarded their first meeting at the Redditch estate, when it talked about how Waltaquin learned what she knew. And I think even then, Andrias, something was tripping off his side. So I think they both knew each other and something wasn't lining up between them. Obviously, things got very much out of balance, I would say, when obviously it was revealed that she was behind the corpses rising. That was her, and obviously the implications that she killed her entire family, essentially, with that. She's a very interesting character. Again, her motivations as to her defection are strange. Her leaving the unit in the first place was obviously when Fred was announced himself as Levantia Shatham. So why she didn't want to stay part of that, I assume she saw where things were going. But again, it's not. Again, the problem with her is that it's not made clear what really she wants to do. Because by this time she already joins with the faction of the North. I believe the Blue Fox have already killed Archbishop Joshua, who's never heard from again in that regard. So it is Waltaquin in the North, and obviously she kills Victor and Staris. So did she just do it for the pleasure of it? Was there a reason more? Like, it would line up with her to just do it for the sake of doing it and not having a goal in the future, so to speak. Because like Victor and Staris were killed. What's next? Like, it is really Fred and Andrias, and did she really want? I don't think she wanted to kill Andrias, but she knew by her actions that they would end up coinciding together. I don't know. It's hard to say what she really wanted, or really that she's definitively dead. Even though Andrias definitely killed her, or certainly stabbed her, she was absolutely adamant that Andrias had not seen the last of her, and no body was ever found according to the records in the library afterwards. So it is a bit ambiguous if she's dead or not. It would certainly make sense, and it makes acceptable sense why she wouldn't be dead, given she definitely knew a lot of dark magic that it was kind of stated no one else had such an aptitude for. Certainly, I think it was a conversation with Catherine or Estald when regarding the church, and about the similar magic employed, that the church didn't go as far with it as Waltaquin did, whether that was intentional or not, to keep, whether they knew as much as Waltaquin or not. So it would make sense that she had more intimate knowledge of, means beyond death. Why we didn't see these in the aftermath of the DioField Chronicle, if there was a sequel, it wouldn't be a surprise that Waltaquin was involved in some way, shape or fashion. But certainly the manner of her death, I think, definitely shook Andrias, and we can talk more about that later. But she was really an interesting character. Her relationship, I think, she didn't have as much of a relationship with Iska and Fredret. Obviously she did with Andrias or anyone else really. So again, I enjoyed their dynamic very much. They definitely seemed to be, very much was Waltaquin kind of, very much lusting for Andrias in some regards, and Andrias just not having any of it. But she was very clear. She kind of saw through him, and she knew that he knew she could see through him. even as much as he wanted to play it off. So they had a fun dynamic. I do think the nature of their parting, so to speak, was actually one of the more fascinating and I won't say emotional parts of the game, but it was definitely the situation. It's her. I guess her reaction to how it ended was different than what you would have expected. You didn't expect her to go hug Andrias after he just plunged her. So I thought it was very interesting from that point of view, her death, so to speak. And it's again, it's one of those things in games where you could there are some games where you are very much certain characters die and they find some sort of bullshit reason to be alive again. If Waltaquin was actually alive, it would make sense. There's enough laid out here, there's enough built up in her development here that it would make sense given what she knew and what she had control over, that maybe death wasn't quite the end for her, that there was going to be one twist left for her. So I thought she was a very interesting character. Again, I wish her motivations as to why, what she was planning to achieve with her defections made a little bit more sense, or laid out a little bit more, because there's no words as to why between Andrias and Waltaquin at their showdown. You're very much thrust into a fight scene, so you don't really understand why. But anyway, I think it was clear that she saw through Andrias, probably saw that her eventual death. I don't know. Again, I do think it's very vague as to what her end goals actually were once she left, but I think at least in this case, I don't think it stops her from being a fascinating character nevertheless, and one of the more enjoyable characters, despite her twisted moral compass and her sadistic nature that very much pulled everyone away from ease, including Fred. Iscarion, obviously, who has a very strong moral compass, obviously very much against what she had become, so to speak, or rather her true self. But I thought she was a very fun character, and I think it'd be more than understandable if we hadn't actually seen the last of her. I think that's actually acceptable in this regard, unlike some other characters.
Well, what do we have here? You don't look like bandits. Mercenaries, perhaps?
And I might ask, who are you?
I am Iscarion Colchester.
Iscarion Colchester, obviously one of the other main characters, is a fascinating character as well. Has a very strong moral compass, very much a sense of right and wrong. But I think what was his most interesting ideology was his sympathy to democracy and how he sympathized with the whole democratic movement, and the tension that caused between more so himself and Fred, more so in the months where Fred and Iscarion were left to deal with some of the looting and the uprisings when Waltaquin and Andrias went over to the frontier, which again was another fun moment for those two. But I thought this is one of the things that the DioField Chronicle did very well, was to create that conflict between Iscarion and Fred with regard to the democratic movement. It was very clear the two sides, how they saw things. Iscarion obviously wants better for the common people. He very much wanted He was very much, I think we both sympathise with the idea of limiting casualties where possible. Certainly Fred was earlier in the story, but very much the means, as Andrias put later, was very different. They had the same goals, but the means were different. Fredret saw things very much as a king should be obeyed, and regardless of the fact that king's a fool, as the argument Iscarion put forward, doesn't matter. That was Fredret's view, that it didn't matter. It was the king needs to be obeyed. Whereas Iscarion sympathised with the democratic views, maybe there could be a better way of doing things. Ultimately, Andrias pushed back on this eventually as well, saying that it was better that one wise person in charge was better than 1,000 fools. You can see the point of view from both sides of it, but again, Iscarion's moral compass driving him and his actions, I think he's a very strong character in that regard. He's a very... I loved his voice delivery as well. I thought, again, it just fitted the character very well. A character that was very much torn in terms of, being a mercenary, and initially his view on mercenary is very much, we go where we're told, we're mercenaries. And then his ideology seemed to change as well. Certainly that chapter 4, that frontier expedition, seemed to change everyone in that regard. Obviously, Iscarion found himself pulled apart with the idea of democracy versus Fred's view. Fred, alone, away from Andrias, definitely from that point forward was much more vocal about issues that he saw and disagreements that he had. And obviously, I feel like Andrias and Waltaquin also changed the way when they were away too. There were a couple of comments, or one comment, I think it may have been Izzy, Someone mentioned that Andrias was I think actually Fred actually mentioned it to Andrias, that he was different, or things seemed different to him in their months apart. Certainly a lot changed for the group in that regard during that pivotal, I think, moment in chapter 3 rather, as well. Iscarion got pretty upset with Waltaquin killing innocent civilians. Again, his moral compass was, his morality was very much pulled apart as to where he needed to be. Ultimately, it was the right thing for him to do as a character, to leave. That was certainly where things were going. His discontentment and his moral compass had definitely been, I guess, his morality was definitely being pulled apart from him from a couple of different angles, and it made sense for him as a character as to why he left. Again, I wish it was developed better, the animosity, I guess, from Andrias' side, where, you know, why he's pulling a blade on Iscarion leaving when Iscarion said he was going to leave. I wish more was done there, but for Iscarion himself, I think it was very much, he's a very strong character in this game. I think his was given the time to drift apart from the group, so to speak. It wasn't, him leaving was not a sudden thing like Waltaquin was, even though I think Waltaquin was more so bored than anything else, that when she left. Iscarion's was very much seen coming, and I think he was given the right exit for him, even though in the library it says that he may have been killed by a thief. Seems a little weird for someone like Iscarion to be killed such a careless way from just some common thief. So it is only a rumor, of course, but anyway, I don't believe it. I believe Waltaquin's not dead, and I don't believe Iscarion is dead either. So again, it says he hasn't been seen or heard from since he left, but tales abound of a lone knight who crossed over to the Rotail mainland and defected to Porrand. Some say, however, he was murdered by a thief. I think that's more so just rumor. I can't imagine that. If that is his end, that's a very unsatisfying end for Iscarion. I do think he's out there somewhere. It makes sense for him to defect to the alliance. That, you know, he had alliance ties. He felt bad having to involve the alliance in obviously the kingdom's attempts to repel the empire. He didn't want to have to use that connection, so it makes sense why he would go there. I do wish more was done with himself and Tremina. Obviously there was a rapport there. There's a hint at a romantic relationship there. The two obviously had ideologies. It's very much alluded to that Iscarion aided in Galvin Yahavo's escape. This is something that both is inferred not just immediately afterwards, but in the conversation between Tremina and Andrias. It's very much alluded to that he sympathized obviously with the democratic movement, so that was the reason for him aiding in that escape. So, you know, obviously you could see the different ways he was pulled apart, and I think that was done very well. Just I wish so I think Iscarion overall has a much more satisfying end, so to speak, or departure from the Blue Foxes than Waltaquin. I don't believe he's dead personally, but yeah, Iscarion Colchester I thought is a really well-rounded character whose motivations are clear to see. They're given the proper development, and it's one of the few instances in this game where I could say that is definitely the case. So Iscarion Colchester I think was a fantastic character in the DioField Chronicle.
Wait, Riaz. Going back to Leicestershire after all this time, it brought back memories.
That it did.
And it made me wonder, am I still that same person?
You haven't changed much. You're still the Fredret Lester I knew.
Fredret Lester is one of the main characters, I would say, of the DioField Chronicle. Not just in the start, but obviously towards the end. Obviously plays very much a focal part. I would say he's actually the quietest of the four of them. The four being Andrias, Isca, and Waltaquin. Right until chapter 4. Again, it's that pivotal mission where Andrias and Waltaquin go to the frontier. Fredret and Iscarion stay behind. It's really from this point forward I think that drives Fred's character forward. He becomes a lot more vocal about his displeasures for some aspects. He becomes a lot more vocal in general, and he's pushed to the fore. I think his own motivations, I think, pushes to the fore when it's Victor and Starus fighting for basically the throne when Rhaegal passes away. And I think there is a part, obviously, in Fred's that it outright says in the library afterwards that he was driven to realise the dying wish of his friend Levantia Shatham. And having been told how neither Starus nor Victor were worthy heirs to the throne after Rhaegal's death, is something that Andrias has said to him. He was I think that very much motivated him into action and the path that he ended up taking, where he falsely declared himself to be Levantia Shatham, which is actually confirmed afterwards that the mark of the blessed that he carved into his hand was a fake. He was not Levantia Shatham. He was, in the end, he was Fredret Lester. But I think part of him wanted to quell the civil war, and he probably saw himself as a better leader than both Starus and Victor, and could back a claim to the throne, which made sense. So I think his motivations were very much clear, and he was one of the more popular characters of the Blue Foxes, and that was obviously made apparent by the jubilation that both not only the Blue Foxes themselves, or the Waltaquin, had when he announced himself as Fredret Lester, but also the people themselves when he unveiled himself to be Levantia Shatham as well. They very much drew to him, and I think this power did end up going to his head. Again, I think it was a little rushed how his descent occurred, but you could certainly see him changing. Other characters could see him changing as well. Isca obviously saw it, Izzy saw it, Andrias saw it, and I think by chapter 6 and 7, certainly he'd shown qualities that weren't befitting of a proper ruler. He was certainly allowing his he obviously wanted the Imperials out of Alatane more than anything else, and seemed to sacrifice anything in between to make that happen. And I think this is what the sticking point with Andrias was. He obviously belittled him for jumping at shadows, and I think we saw a shift, certainly at the end, where Fred, obviously before, early in the game, Fred, obviously one of his main things was to minimize casualties. It was to make sure to bring casualties to an end. And when they came to overturning the Imperial to the Imperial surrender, or the surrender to the Imperials, he didn't really care as to how many people were killed in that, and that was Lorraine's objection too, which obviously he immediately disregarded. And I think Andrias had already made his mind up at this stage. And it is said afterwards that, his reputation as Blue Fox made him popular. His ascent to the throne was generally welcomed. Over time, however, he lost his composure and his drive, and his charisma slowly waned. Part of this you can see at the beginning of the mine mission, where Shivat talks about it or mentions it, well, what's gotten into him, and Andrias like, I have no idea, essentially. Like even Andrias is struggling to justify it at this stage. And he became more heady. He made tactical mistakes, the biggest obviously focusing his forces when the main Imperial encampment, which basically allowed them to basically invade it from the east. And obviously Andrias, warned him about it. More and more errors. He listened to Andrias less. He did listen to Andrias' final plan, but of course, I think Fred's, his future was set in stone by that point anyway. I think Andrias knew he was going to kill him to realize one of his end goals. So I think Fred, it's a sad story. He was obviously affected quite badly by not just the passing of his father, I'm sure, but Levantia Shatham also being passing away, and not being able to live his life and ascend to the throne possibly as well. Certainly in the death of Ivangar, I think he certainly felt a regret after Ivangar passed that it should be Levantia now who should be stepping up towards the throne. I think that part was part of what drove his contentment of Victor and Starus. It was just for that reason, because once Ivangar was killed, obviously Levantia had the mark of the blessed, and was very much someone who was spoken to as great character and wisdom beyond his years. Certainly someone who would have done well on the throne, but obviously never had the chance as well. And it's quite sad, because after the final battle is done and Zavatia is killed and Fred thinks it's over, and obviously the one last surprise is that his best friend really in Andrias was the one to hold the gun and outright shoot him and kill him, because even if it was inferred, like obviously the screen goes black as the bullet goes off, but it outright says in the library, in the end, even his closest friend Andrias abandoned him, and he was killed in the final battle against the Empire. So, yeah, I think there are reasons. Again, we'll talk about Andrias' motivations as well, but for Fred, again, his descent, I think he probably was rushed a little bit from chapter 6, but certainly from chapter 4 is where things began to decline, in terms of he was much more outspoken than he was before. He let things go to his head a bit more, and certainly the power and each speech that he seemed to give as Levantia shaped him to the people seemed to fuel his ego, and more pushback with Andrias and disagreements between the two of them and confrontation. And I don't think Andrias hated Fred at the end, but I certainly think Fred had done enough to show that he wasn't the strong ruler that Alatain needed, and who knows how many more casualties could have come into play had he stayed on the throne afterwards. And of course, here's the thing: just because the Alatain, they obviously repelled the Imperial invasion, so to speak, when they killed Zavatian, doesn't mean the war necessarily ended there. Like this, there's still obviously the Imperial threat from the mainland, even if one of its commanders is gone. They're vastly outnumbered still, and they have vastly less superior technology than what the Empire has. So I still think they're losing. They're in a losing fight one way or the other. So I think this plan was really just devised by Andrias just to make ends of Fred that he could, because I think ultimately one way or the other, whether Zavatian was alive or not, there was going to be an eventual surrender. It was very clear that the Trovan Chauviel Empire was just far too superior in its weaponry, in its tactics, in its just every sense. They were superior military-wise than the Alatains, and there just wasn't enough, especially after the Civil War, of course, as well, with Victor and Staris, and obviously the loss of Ivangar. There was just nothing, I think, that was ultimately going to prevent the Empire from ultimately having their way. I think this ultimately was just a means for Andrias to end Fred as well, and possibly save more lives in that regard.
A flood of memories came rushing forth, of the day that started everything. Memories of a time before I became Andrias Rhondarson.
Last up is, of course, main protagonist Andrias Rhondarson, also serving now as the antagonist, knowing what we know from the end. His whole thing, of course, his story is that he is a secret agent from the Trovel-Chovian Empire, actually a member of the Empire's elite unity, Eins Welt. Blessed with a natural talent for magic owning to his Alatanian blood, the Empire abducted him at a young age, trained him in the art of combat. His objective was to infiltrate the inner circles of Alatain's government, to intensify civil unrest, and to generally cause trouble for the kingdom. It was drilled into him that his purpose is to aid the Empire in taking control of the kingdom and its jade to bring prosperity. So Andrias is obviously the antagonist the entire way. He is the one who orchestrates everything, of course. He obviously has deep connections to Duke Hende. It's written upon returning to Alatain, he was taken in by Duke Hende, who has long and secret dealings with the Empire and arranged for him to become Chamberlain to Levantia Shatham. It is outrageous to say it as well, before Andrias kills Fred, is that his objective was to obliterate Levantian Shugal. But I think in his own mind as well, I think having met Levantia Shatham, he also discovered a second goal: to give power to those who would do right with it. And he was so clearly inspired, and it was said that he couldn't quite describe what he felt when Levantia and Fred invited him to come along with them. And I think something so trivial as just playing with some kids as kids, given his childhood, remembering that his family was brutally murdered by Savatian, I think gave him new hope. And I think he really was ready to cast his lot in with Levantia. And when he was killed, it was very much back to square one, back to being a pawn of the Empire, back to Duke Hende's role, or serving with Duke Hende. It's certainly one thing I will say about the DioField Chronicle: it offers a lot in replayability, as in you look through the story through an entirely different lens once you beat it once, and it's very clear when you play it again, the signs everywhere of who Andrias was and what he actually pulled along the way. Even at the beginning of the game, when they intercept the bandits attacking Lorraine's carriage, Izzy talks about what stroke of luck it was we actually got that Imperial intel. No stroke of luck, as it turns out. Probably just an event orchestrated by Andrias and Duke Hende to get Andrias in Duke Hende's mercenary unit. And it seems very likely that Yolden was actually killed by Umarida, who obviously he was killed by a bow, and Umarida obviously uses advanced tech in terms of weaponry with a bow, killed by a bow, uses a bow. Seems likely, I think, that she was behind Yulzin's death. There was obviously a clear gain for Andrias and company out of it. They became the head of Duke Hende's private mercenary group, and everywhere throughout the story, you see prints here and there of Andrias' involvement with the Empire. The marks were all there throughout the whole story. His sympathetic dealings, so to speak, with any Imperial prisoners that he took in later with Umarida, his aversion to engage the Imperials when it made sense to chase them through certain regards. There were so many telltale signs that Andrias' true motivations lay with the Empire. But of course, easy to say that in hindsight. Obviously, when you play the game, you see it all much more so. When you're playing it, very much so, you don't really see it. Waltaquin seemed to certainly see through Andrias. There were other characters that definitely did not see his deception coming. So it's a very convincing performance from Andrias to pull the strings. He certainly had everyone fooled. I'd say with the exception of Waltaquin. Waltaquin certainly was suspicious of Andrias' true nature. And I think he knew that as well. Probably maybe the reason why she had to die in some regards. Not only because, well, obviously she was their enemy, but Andrias saw to it personally that he would kill her on his own, which makes obviously a lot of sense in hindsight. It also makes sense that Andrias is probably his origins. Obviously, he's talked about he was born on Eastfield and taken away from Eastfield. It seems likely he was part of the Shukbolts dynasty, who would consume small amounts of jade from an early age, allowing them to develop extraordinary magical and physical abilities. These physical abilities you could probably see manifest in a couple of different ways. One, probably in the battle with Waltaquin. At the start as well, of course, with the carriage and the way his assassination ability that you use in-game. He's obviously able to move extremely quickly. He's obviously able to dodge Waltaquin's attacks very, very quickly as well. And probably most tellingly, obviously, at the end, when he outpaces Zavatian Shugel to get to the throne, so to speak, as he's escaping to cut himself off, or to cut Zavatian off, and obviously kill him very swiftly as well. So it strongly implies that he's part of that Shukbolts dynasty that obviously fell apart when the Century War occurred. As much as Andrias likes to try and close himself off, he is transparent in some regards. His words don't line up with his actions. Certainly multiple characters were able to detect when he wasn't looking himself or asking him if he was okay. He obviously had to try and hide his pain. And I think that it was that. I think his pain of having to kill Waltaquin very much was something that affected him. It was something that he certainly seemed to be conflicted with. Her reaction to her, basically him stabbing her, basically took him by surprise. When she said, "I wish I could see the look on your face." Certainly he was very much thrown off. It did seem he was very upset by her death, even if he didn't try not to let it show. Shivat saw through that. Multiple characters saw through that as well. Certainly his indecisiveness. He tried so hard to justify, Waltaquin's twisted means and saying that her army of dead were very useful to them. He tried very hard to justify Waltaquin's twisted sense of morality to try and purpose it for their ends. He very much tried, but even he couldn't save her from herself in many regards, and I think her death certainly affected him. When Catherine proposed to go on the mission to save the abducted children, initially he thought about the money. Then quickly, when it became personal to him, when obviously it was the manner he was taken away as a child as well, it was something that was on his heart. So he was someone that more so his actions rather than his words kind of came through to showing who he was. He did get snappy and defensive when people tried to see through him or got close to, I guess, locating part of him. He snapped back in particular at Shivat when confronted by Waltaquin. He got defensive with Lorraine when we mentioned about the Shukbolts dynasty as well. He did very much try to shut down vulnerabilities or people seeking out his past when they came up. He shut those down immediately. He tried not to give much away, but there were many of those who did see through him. And I imagine this was part of what he regretted as well, is that he could be seen through. So he wasn't completely detached like Umarida, who there's a lot to be said about. Umarida is very much explicitly, when she joined, very much she was a scout for him. Of course, she was a member of the Empire as well, and she was very much pulling the strings behind the back. I think very much so when she refers to the capital multiple times in the game, the things of the capital are well, I think she's very much referring to the Imperial capital. She is an agent from the Empire, just like Andrias. So, as mentioned, that she was in contact with him before, joined the Blue Foxes, been running undercover missions for him, carried out messages for Duke Hende. When the unit decided to turn it on his master, she chose to side with the Blue Foxes without hesitation. She was very much in the midst of it with Andrias, obviously more so in retrospect than the events of the game. But again, their own mission together when the Imperials were close to Elm Camp, that should have raised a lot of red flags. But again, I didn't see through it, so it fooled me. But she's taught to be robotic and very much disconnected, without joy or sadness. She very much just wanted to serve Andrias. But her aspect is fascinating, obviously in hindsight, because now she's very much an Imperial spy, like Andrias. So yeah, I thought that their dynamic was very interesting. More so on a second playthrough, more so than the first. Again, she's one of those characters where it makes sense for her to be a bit devoid of character, I guess, in one sense, to hide who she really is. In another sense, it's part of her character. It's talked about she was orphaned and doesn't really connect with people, and Andrias moves her to deal with less people, so to speak. So yeah, their dynamic was interesting to say the least. Obviously, the big question at the end is, why did Andrias betray or kill Fredret? And I think it comes down to a couple of things. Mostly, some of them we've explained already, but mostly because it became apparent through chapters somewhat 5 and then 6 that Fred was losing his way. And you might ask, why didn't Andrias say something when Fred falsely claims himself to be Levantia Shatham? I think in parts he wanted to hear it out, because even when he was asked by, I think it was Lorraine, he said, let Fred explain. I think in a sense he was scouting as well, and I think very much so through chapters 5, 6 and 7, Andrias was scouting what kind of king Fred was. What Fred couldn't have known, of course, was the circumstances that led Andrias to be Levantia Shatham's Chamberlain in the first place, and the sense of duty he was already instilled with. Even Zoroak, Izzy's father, talked about how he saw more fire in Andrias's eyes than in Fredret's, despite Fredret losing Levantia and obviously his father. He saw more in Andrias's eyes than in Fred's, and that was very much the fact that to this day Andrias was driven by two things: his revenge on Zavatian Shugel, and obviously his desire to see those in power do right with it. And somewhere along the way, he saw Fred was not going to do right with the power, and it's stated that Andrias, there wasn't anything he wouldn't do to achieve freedom and peace. And I think under Fred, he didn't see peace. I don't think he saw peace with Fred as king. I think it was easier for Andrias to take power for himself, or most likely to install a puppet like Hezelia Shatham, someone who he could control, but the Empire could control, because it's outright stated as well from Hezelia herself that had Victor, installed her as the puppet ruler, she probably would have gone along with that. It's suggested that she very much submits to control, as obviously outright stated as well on the battlefield as well, when Andrias says that they are her superiors. I think very much his plan afterwards was to install Hezelia to the throne rather than Fred. Andrias from the Empire, obviously, basically ruling as a puppet, essentially, the puppet empire, essentially, in Alatain under one of their own. I think that was an easier means to peace than whatever Fred would have done afterwards once they defeated Savatian. Plus, in the end, obviously, again, their empire was far greater than the Kingdom of Alatain. I think it would have ended up in the deaths of not just some of those. Andrias does care, he does care about his subjects, his people, his blue foxes. he talked about how much of an asset they are. He's seen the development of the likes of Vistalt and more so Rickenback. He did care, and of course he does still care for Izzy as well. I think he's moved when Izzy reaffirms her friendship to him and her loyalty to him. Even though he posed the question, why if you had to choose between me and Fred? He was trying to set her up, in a sense, for maybe such an eventuality. He did very much care for her, I think. So I think in the best interest of everyone, I think Fred's death was necessary. And I think he did feel sadness and regret. His voice seemed to shake when he said Fred's name as he pointed the gun at him.
It's over now. Fred.
I think there is a part that very much has regret. Much in the same sense, I think, when he goes back to the Blue Fox's war room afterwards on his own, dressed in imperial colours, the helmet, you can see the helmet of Waltaquin and Fred's glove on a table as he enters. There's a sense in his eyes that it has a resolve, a determination, but I think the look in his eyes also, there's a regret, there's a loneliness, I think there's a regret over the events that he's had to do to get to this point. I think if Andrias, again, I think more so became clear through a second playthrough how much regret there was in him, but also that regret was enough to shake his resolve that he was set so strongly, not just when Zavatian killed his family, but obviously when Levantia was killed as well. I think he lost his chance of a second life, a free life, so to speak, away from the Empire when Levantia was killed. So it is quite sad looking at Andrias in retrospect. I know, right? Like, obviously he pulled everyone along. Maybe he shouldn't feel sympathy because he pulled everyone along. He manipulated everyone. I think to an extent he gaslit people as well. When people came to him with a theory that was sound, and he kind of either snapped back at them or made it seem, is that so kind of comments. And obviously he killed Fred at the end as well. Again, Fred had lost his way, but I don't think Fred had done anything that was particularly malicious. I think the worst thing Fred did, and something Fred felt regret for, was having to manipulate or mislead, mislead definitely Hezelia Shatham to believe that he was her brother, which is also stated afterwards that she knew deep down that Fred wasn't her brother. And that's outright stated. And I think Iscarion saw that as well, because Iscarion commented in the field when they saw Hezelia Shatham how much power the Mark of the Blessed actually gave. And I think in his mind, he's seen Fred fight and he's seen Hezelia fight. And I think he certainly knew the difference between the two, the power that the Mark of the Blessed gave. I think that was something that was indicative that Fred wasn't one of the many hints. And obviously, when you complete the game, it's outright told that Fred obviously faked the mark. But obviously, it's heavy hints are dropped that, talking about Fred's regret and misleading Hezelia, and Umarita obviously talked about Umarita as well. Fred talking about, will this plan work? And you wouldn't have to say that if he really was her, if she really was his sister. So things like that all point to the fact that Fred wasn't Shatham. And I think he had regret over that, but he certainly didn't do anything malicious. Certainly not more so than Andrias did. Certainly, in terms of the things that he did in the end. But a very conflicted character is Andrias, even if it's not outright stated. It's something you do have to look for and see. And there's so many telltale signs of who he is, what he feels. And I do think there is regret there. There's regret when he has to kill Waltaquin, when he has to kill Fred, and I think regret over everything that came when he's alone in that new when he's in the world. It's that new equilibrium kind of sense. Like, how do I go forward? How do I move forward past this moment in my life? What does the path forward for me look like? Because at the end of the day, we get to see no one's reaction. We don't get to see Lorraine's reaction, Izzy's reaction, none of Andrias' allies' reaction, nor do we know what on earth actually happened to them afterwards once his deception is clear. And his deception is clearly clear when he walks back into that room wearing those imperial colours, that imperial cape, that red, that evil looking red on him, because the contrast as he goes through the blue doors on his own. The room is unlit. It's been deserted, it looks like, in terms of no one's been there for a while. We don't know what happens to Andrias's blue foxes afterwards. Whether some were executed, whether some were given a new life somewhere else. Who knows? There's a bunch of people who wouldn't have stood for Andrias's deception, but we know nothing of their future, their fate. And that, in that sense, I guess they want to leave it open-ended, that if a sequel were to come, they could do something with. Whereas if you... So I think that vagueness in the ending is left for a possible sequel. I hope we get one. There's enough here to be certainly well invested in for a sequel. There's enough conflict, there's enough characters made to pick something up with. Again, I don't think they're developed very well, but there's enough to be getting on with to make a sequel. There's obviously... Andrias's motivations himself don't end here. Like, regardless of what his position is, we assume it's a general, given that he's donning the similar clothing to Zavatian Shugel at the end. He's not obviously wearing a crown or anything. He's not the emperor, of course, who we know nothing of essentially in the events, basically, other than the fact that Shovian basically discovered how to use modern magic into weaponry, which is why he was able to take over so many countries and territories so soon in his time, including, now you have to assume, Alatane in that. But it's outright saying that Andrias has remained close in contact to the Empire, always followed their orders, but has no intention of remaining their puppet. He longs for peace and freedom, is willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his goal. So he has goals to take down the Empire in some regard. He has obviously held long disdained hatred for the Empire and Zavatian for what they did to his family and what obviously they did to him and how they controlled him. So he's obviously got unfinished business. Sadly, to see his objective through, he did have to kill Fred, even though Fred wasn't inherently evil per se. But I do think part of this was just to minimize losses and maybe to give Andrias a better position of strength to fight out of. And it gives him a means to do that, both killing Zavatian and Fred in one go, giving another platform to fight another day, essentially. And the last cutscene is very much, it's literally named after that. The last cutscene, the caption on, if you go watch it back in the library, the last cutscene is Andrias returns to his post to prepare for the coming battle. Whether that's the Alliance, his allies, his former allies around the Blue Foxes, maybe the Empire itself, who knows? It's hard to say, and I think it's open-ended for that reason, just because obviously maybe for in the event of a sequel, which I hope happens, I really do. But I think with everything else, I think just ultimately why did he kill Fred? I think he knew they didn't stand a chance. The Empire's tech, heck, even they have flipping air balloons, essentially ships. They're taking guns to the fight. Zavatian shows up with troops with guns to the surrender, whereas Fred has soldiers with swords and shields. They're clearly outclassed. They can control wyverns with their modern magic. They can do anything, essentially. They were completely superior to Alatane and anyone else. They will crush anyone in their way. So I think to save casualties, I think Andrias, and obviously to serve his own personal goals that he set not just when Zavatian killed his family, but obviously when Levantia Shatham died as well. I just think his goals took precedence over everything else in his life, even if Fred was a close friend, and I think there is regret. But yeah, Andrias Rhondarson, I think he's a fantastic character. He offers a great deal of replayability to go through this game again once you've beaten it. Again, you'll be over leveled, take your levels, go 2x speed, you'll blitz through the game pretty quickly. You can see all these things. You can see the game from a completely fresh perspective once you beat the game once and you know what you know. You know who Andrias Rhondarson really is. And you'll see the little details here and there that I think actually do more justice on a second playthrough, more so than the first. I think that's the mark of how strong this game's story is that you see things from a different light in a second playthrough, and I think that's a good mark of a story. It's not indicative of a good story, but it certainly helps to go back through something you played once before and see it through a completely different lens, and that's certainly what the DioField Chronicle achieves here. And I think this game's actually better having played it a second time. I think you'll feel better about playing the game a second time than you do playing it for the first time. I think the first time it's so repetitive in its gameplay that I think you disregard the story in many ways, but I think being able to blitz through it a second time, I think you really do see a better sense of the whole thing as a whole. The the Yulzim mercenary unit becoming obviously the Dukende angle, Waltaquin, the Civil War. Again, I do wish Prince Ivangar was more developed. I do wish some aspects were developed better and spent more time with. But other than that, and other than the absence of the characters that are in the game, being that they're yes, there are characters in the game, but they are weak. They're devoid of character in many ways. I think the DioField Chronicle is an excellent story. One you can really immerse yourself in the politics. I know some people don't like the politics of it. I think they're done very well here. I think the tactics are done well here. I do wish the Alliance was fleshed out a little bit more. I wish we had a more understanding of the leaders of the Alliance and even the Shovian Empire as well in that regard. Again, I wish the leaders of the regions, I wish were developed a little bit more. But despite that, there's a lot that they handle really well and develop really well. I just wish more time was spent in that. But overall, I think it's a game that spawns a lot of debate, intrigue, conversation of the aftermath, and obviously the process leading to. And I always think that's a good mark of a good fantasy game, where it's set in a fictional world where you can have a conversation like that. And I think the DioField Chronicle really delivers on that. And should we see a sequel, I think there's a lot that you can take from that and build upon in a sequel. But yeah, in the meantime, again, that was my thoughts, at least, on the DioField Chronicle. There's a lot of stuff I've written down that I probably didn't get to as well. But I really feel that it's a strong game worth talking about, and I hope you've got something from this absolute waffle. Because, again, I don't prepare a script for this. I very much have a few loose notes, hit a topic, run with it. I do stumble over myself, so I do apologise. But if you stuck this long, I really do appreciate it. I hope you got something from it. There's plenty of posts on Reddit as well, which I recommend as well, checking out on some of the aspects of the DioField Chronicle's ending explained. I hope I've done some justice to explain the ending in different regards, be it from Fred's view, Andrias's view, etc., etc. Yeah. So thanks very much for watching, and until next time.